mic working? Yes. Excellent. I'm going to talk about the Adams family. If you know anything about the Adams family, you probably know it from one of two places. There was a fairly important biography by a man named David McCullough. You may have read that. There was an HBO series, what, 10, 15 years ago? Multi-session thing that was based on David McCullough's biography. Where did he get his information? He got it from the Adams papers in Boston, where I worked. Luckily for me, I came to the Adams papers right after David McCullough's novel. I had to raise money, but because the book was so successful, it helped me a lot. Almost always before I make any kind of presentation on history, I point out a couple of things. One, what is history? Is it what happened? No. It's what historians say happened. And what I'm going to try and do is give you a couple of examples today of how history changes. There is a thing called presentism. That is when current historians, thinking about things around them, interpret the past based on what they believe. When I was the editor-in-chief of the Adams papers, one of the big controversies, that this is in 2004 or 5, was gay marriage. And people would constantly, well not frequently, come up to me and say, what would John Adams have said about gay marriage? I said, I have no idea. He would never have considered it, because in that period, while certainly there were gay people, it was not an issue. But people at that time wanted to have advocates in the past. So a lot of times what happens with historians is that they go through the documents, picking and choosing, in order to support their case. There's an old French historical expression, no documents, no history. Getting back to the Adamses. One of the reasons that we know so much about the Adams family, the one that I'm concerned with, not Morticia in that group, is that they saved everything. They were diarists. They sent letters back and forth. And one of the things that was unfortunate for John and Abigail, but fortunate for us, is that they were separated for years and years at a time. The only way you could communicate was through mail. We have, at the Massachusetts Historical Society, 1,170 letters between John and Abigail. And they stretch from the earliest one, this was, we call it the Miss Adorable letter. It's a little difficult for you to read. John met Abigail. He was a little bit older. She was 14 and he was 23. They met because John's friend, Richard Cranch, was courting her older sister. And Cranch took John Adams along to the Smith house. Abigail's father, William Smith, was a minister, and he stayed for dinner. He records in his diary, because we have all of this written record, that he was really not very impressed by the younger daughter. That was 1759. This is 1762. Things have changed a little bit. It reads, by the same token that the bearer hereof sat up with you last night, I hereby order you to give me many kisses and many, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, this is the first letter. It's a courtship letter. They married 2 years later. Who were these people? Abigail was the middle sister. She had a younger sister, older sister, and a brother. We have a lot of the correspondence between the sisters. If any of you ladies have sisters, you know that you might communicate with them a little bit by phone. They communicated by letters. So a lot of the information that we have about the families, about the health, about the furniture, about all of those aspects of life come from those letters from the sisters. They were like phone conversations. The brother was a problem. William Smith Jr. had 7 children, and he left the family, went off. Later died an alcoholic. The sisters all but disowned him. Part of the problem then was that the families, the Adamses, the Cranches, etc., took care of the children. One of Abigail's nieces lived with them her entire life. These are problems that families had to face at that time, still do. To give you an idea of their background, these 2 houses, the house on the left is the house that John Adams was born in. The house on the right is the house that John Quincy was born in. It was the first home of John and Abigail Adams. It's still there. The Park Service will allow you to tour this. It's in Quincy, Massachusetts. This is the house, this is a current rendition. This is the house that Abigail grew up in. Actually, it's only half of the house because at some point they cut it in half and moved it to a new site. There's an Abigail Adams Historical Society, and this is their home. The things I point out in this is that they both came from very modest backgrounds. When they married, he was 29, she was 21. What did they look like then? Well, we have a little bit of an idea. That's John Adams, portrait by Benjamin Blythe, an artist who lived in Salem, Massachusetts, about 15 miles north of where they lived in Quincy. This is in 1766. That wasn't his hair, that was a wig. And the fetching Abigail. One of the things that I try to convey in talking about the Adams family is that they were extremely important and prominent in American life from the 1770s right down until 1900. And the first 3 generations, John and Abigail, their children, and their grandchildren, usually come to us in a sanitized version. They had issues. They had 4 children who survived to adulthood. The oldest was the daughter, Abigail. They called her Nabby. John Quincy Adams, who was fairly successful. Charles, who was not. We'll talk more about him. And Thomas Boylston. Later, this is in the 1790s when the children are young adults. Abigail wrote this: "I will not say that all my geese are swan. I hope, however, that I have no occasion to blush for the conduct of any of my children. Perhaps I build more expectation upon the rising fame and reputation of one of them," we know which one, "than of another. But where much is given, much shall be required. I know their virtues, and I am not blind to their failings." One of the things that I always wonder about in almost any situation Is a person great, or are they great because they were put in a situation, they were put in an occasion where they were forced to do things? John Adams was a very successful lawyer. He started out wanting to be a farmer. His father was a farmer. He told his father he didn't want to go to school, he didn't want to go to college. He was going to stay on the farm. So his father took him out for a couple of days and made him work hard on the farm. He decided to go to college. As a matter of fact, his father, both his father, also John Adams, and John Adams, the president, were very interested in acquiring land. And the only record we have of the father ever selling land is he sold 10 acres to pay tuition for John to go to Harvard. He was successful. Took a little while for him to find his feet. He taught school for a while. Then he went and studied law. And by the early 1860s, he was a fairly successful lawyer. I mentioned that John and Abigail married in 1764. In order to earn money, in order to be a successful lawyer, you had to follow the court, and there was a circuit. So even very early on, John would be gone for weeks at a time because he'd have to follow the judges around the circuit in Massachusetts. More and more, Abigail had to take responsibility for the children, for the servants, for the farm. The servants that they had were mostly those people who were tenants on the farm. In 1774, the unpleasantness with the British, John went off to the Continental Congress. This was his first extended stay away from Abigail. He went again in 1775 to 1777, and he was at the Continental Congress in Philadelphia when the new country declared its independence. When you ask somebody, if we went out on the street now and grabbed somebody and said, "Tell me who's responsible for American independence," who would they say? No, for declaring independence. They would say Thomas Jefferson. Hooey. That's the strongest term I'm going to use. John Adams, among the people who were present at the occasion, referred to him as the Atlas of Independence. Looking back now, we think, oh my God, almost all the people of the Continental Congress must have jumped on board right away. No, they had to be convinced. And the man who spoke most eloquently, the man who was most convincing, was John Adams. Thomas Jefferson, as a matter of fact, the vote was taken. What date was the vote taken on independence? July 2nd. Why do we celebrate the 4th? According to John Adams, it should have been the 2nd, because that's the vote was taken. He was the most persuasive orator at the Continental Congress. He was also one of a committee. Jefferson didn't write this on his own. He drafted it. Benjamin Franklin and John Adams, a couple other people, but Franklin and John Adams edited it, cleaned it up a little bit. It's not that I don't like Thomas Jefferson. I just like Adams more. Shortly after this, a year later, Adams was sent to Europe as a diplomat. We needed to do a couple of things. One, raise money. We needed money from whoever we get money from. As it turned out, we got money from the French and from the Dutch. and he was instrumental in both cases. In 1778, he was there negotiating a treaty with the French. The French become involved in our war, and one of the reasons that we won our independence, it happened more quickly because of French aid and French Navy and French forces. Lafayette, you know the name Lafayette, was part of this deal. He was in Europe. He came back one time. He left in 1778, came back one time, and was in Europe until 1788. So for most of 10 years, he was away. What kind of guy was John Adams? I think of him as being pretty dense in some ways. When he first went to Europe, I have a little excerpt to read. When he first went to Europe, he went with his son, John Quincy. This is one of the reasons I think that John Quincy was as successful. He stayed with his father. He was educated in Europe. He met a lot of great people, but I'll tell you more about that. Anyway, he left with John Quincy in February of 1778. He wrote his first letter back to Abigail in April. She didn't get it until June. She hadn't heard anything from February to June. In his letter, it was a short letter. He didn't really mention much about John Quincy, but he did say, "To tell you the truth, I admire the ladies here. Don't be jealous. They are handsome and very well educated. Their accomplishments are exceedingly brilliant, and their knowledge of letters and arts exceeds that of English ladies much, I believe." He also noted about Franklin. I don't know if you know about Franklin, but he was very friendly with some of the ladies. "My venerable colleague enjoys a privilege here that is much to be envied. Being 70 years of age, the ladies not only allow him to embrace them as often as he pleases, but they are perpetually embracing him." How did Abigail respond? The thing that she noted in a long letter. Also, one of the things, when they were apart, John always wanted reports about the farm. How are the animals? How are the crops? She said nothing about the farm. But she went on and on and on about the importance of educating women in America. One of the things that John Adams did, and I don't know if you can make it out, this is his signature down here, Ben Franklin, John J. He helped negotiate the peace that ended the war between England and the United States when the British finally recognized independent United States. This is a document from the National Archives. Abigail and her daughter, Abigail Nabby, went to join John in France in 1784. Well, I'm running backwards here. You remember the houses that they lived in? This is the house they lived in Paris. So from being a local minister's daughter, by the way, she never went to school. She read at home. Her father had a nice library. From you saw the house that they lived in prior to that, there was a little change in their life. Not only did Abigail move up to a bigger house, she met the King of France, later the King of England. She traveled in a society that she wouldn't have dreamed of a few years before. After the peace settlement and after a little while in France, they went to England, and John Adams was our first minister. They didn't use the term ambassador, but it was comparable to being America's first ambassador to England. When they returned in 1788, this is the house that they lived in. They called it Peacefield. The Adams people now refer to it as the Old House. If you go to Quincy, you can tour this house. It's been enlarged, but this is what they can. The reason that her uncle, a man named Tufts, Cotton Tufts, told them, when you come back, you can't go back to that house you lived in, the little one that I showed you before. He said, you have to get another house. I'll find one for you. So this house was purchased for them just before they came back from England.
What is on the roof line here?
I'm not sure. It looks like a little gallery, perhaps. They were close to the water. I mean, so maybe it was something that the Vassal family owned this before, and they were big traders in Massachusetts. So maybe it was a gallery, you know, like a widow's watch kind of thing. I'm not sure. It's not there anymore. I'm rolling too fast. Get my sequence. John Adams was elected vice president. In the first years of our government under the Constitution, there was a different way of electing president and vice president. Whoever finished first in the presidential election was president. If you finished second, you were vice president. This continued until 1800 when there was some difficulty, and so the 12th Amendment was passed so that, and also another thing, there were no political parties at the beginning of the country. They only developed during the first generation. So John Adams finished second in the presidential election to Washington and was president after Washington. One of the things to note, I think, is that both John Adams and John Quincy Adams, out of the first 8 presidents, were the only ones that weren't reelected. All the other presidents served 2 terms. Both John Adams and his son, John Quincy Adams, were much more important in American history before they were president than when they were president. Now, let me see if I can. So after, apologize, I'm not as adept, at controlling this little fella. Okay. Abigail, one of the things that's happening when the United States is first being formed and the government is being formed, there were no traditions. How did you do something? This is a letter, this is a draft of a letter, not the letter that was sent, but it's from Abigail to Martha Washington. And this just before Abigail becomes First Lady. And she asks Martha Washington for advice. How do you do this? How do you do that? And Martha Washington wrote back and for the most part said, you'll be fine. She didn't tell her much more than that. So, after the presidency, which was very rocky, Adams left not being very popular with the people. They went back to Quincy. And this is what they looked like about the time. This would be early 1800, 1801. This is what they looked like at that time. While they were in, when they were in Washington, Adams was the first president to reside in we call it the White House, they called it the President's House at that time. And his first letter back to Abigail, who wasn't there, included this little saying, I pray heaven to bestow the best blessings on this house and all that shall hereafter inhabit it. May none but honest and wise men ever rule under this roof. This was included, carved into one of the mantels in one of the dining rooms by FDR. And then when Kennedy was president and they revived some of the rooms, they kept this. But it's a very famous, whether it happened or not is debatable. Then, okay, moving on to another generation. This is one of the first pages in John Quincy Adams' diary. He started the diary when he was 12 years old, and he continued it until shortly before his death when he was 80 years old. It's 15,000 pages long. This is the young child diarist. Sketching kind of thing. If it was a kid now, he'd be drawing rockets and whatever. But these are the ships. When he went to Europe with his father, he sketched some of the ships that they were on. This is what the diary looks like later in life. He didn't know what a margin was. He detailed everything. What he would do, there are different levels of his diary. At night he would make an outline, and then when he had time he would fill it in. And it is one of the most important documents in American history for the period from the 1790s to the 1840s. He knew everybody, he went everywhere. To tell you how precocious he was, when he went to Europe with his father, the United States is trying to convince European countries to recognize the independence of the United States, to try and get them to loan money to the United States. So one of the things they did is they sent a minister to Russia, a man named Francis Dana. Problem was, going to Russia, the international diplomatic language at that time was French. So all diplomats, if you went anywhere, if you were in Poland or any of the German states or France or Russia, if you were going to talk to any of the diplomats, you exchanged it in French. Francis Dana didn't speak French. So John Adams sent his 14-year-old son as secretary to the American minister to Russia. He was the interpreter. Do any of you have 14-year-old children or grandchildren? Can you imagine them going? And this, you didn't fly there, you didn't take a train. This is difficult. He was there for 2 years. Russia never, at least at that time, didn't recognize it. He'll go back later. He came across from Russia to Paris on his own at the age of 16. They gave him a little money and off he went. Remember what Abigail said, all my geese are not swans, but we know who the swan was. As time went by, he becomes one of the most successful, if not the most successful, American diplomat of all time. As a matter of fact, in a survey of diplomatic historians where they rank secretaries of state, he's number one. Over the years, he was minister to the Netherlands, Prussia, Russia, and England. before he even became Secretary of State. Let me see if I can get this to go the right way. Oop. This is the young, dashing John Quincy Adams. It's a portrait that he had made by John Singleton Copley, famous portrait painter in England, actually an American in England. He had this done for his mother because he hadn't seen his mother in a long time, sent it back. Even he said it was a little more favorable than it should have been. Copley was a friend of the family, and I think he wanted Abigail to have a nice picture. Anyway, in 1797, he married a woman from London, Louisa Catherine Smith. This is her a little younger, in her teens. Her father was an American from Maryland. He had a business in London, very loyal. When the revolution broke out, he took his family to France. Then they came back after the revolution. And Louisa had a difficult time with the Adams family. For example, in 1809, they came back to the United States in 1801. And she was introduced to the family. They'd been married for several years. They had a couple of children. One they named, their first child. I mean, if you are a good patriot and you lived during this time, if you had a son, what would you name him? George Washington. So they named their first son George Washington Adams. Abigail didn't approve. It should have been John. So their second son was John Adams II. It was difficult being Abigail's daughter-in-law. In 1809, the United States and Russia opened up diplomatic relations. And President Madison asked John Quincy to go to be our first ambassador to Russia. So they packed up everything. They had three sons. One was an infant, Charles Francis. Before they left, John Adams broke the news that Abigail said, "You're not taking those two older boys to Russia. They need to be educated in Massachusetts." Louisa had no say in the matter. They left in 1809. The next time they saw those two sons was in 1817. Both of those boys were unsuccessful. The boy that went along, you see the parallel with John Quincy Adams here? Going back a little bit. The two boys that didn't go or stay in Europe, Thomas Boylston and Charles Adams, that's Abigail and John's sons, both turned out to be alcoholics. Both died unsuccessful. The two boys that stayed in Massachusetts with Abigail and the family both turned out unsuccessful and died relatively young. The boy that went along became a very successful diplomat. As a matter of fact, he, like his father and his grandfather, was an American ambassador to England and a very famous man during the Civil War. So they went to Russia. John Quincy got along with the emperor, the czar. They were very successful. And then the United States got involved in a war, the War of 1812, towards the end of the war, John Quincy was sent to the Netherlands to head up the peace negotiations, the Treaty of Ghent, 1814. He left Louisa Catherine and little Charles Francis in Russia. He sent word, I'm not coming back to Russia. Come on, I'll meet you in Paris. So Louisa, poor Louisa, had to go with, I think by that time, 8-year-old and a couple of servants overland on a wagon. They left in February, so it had to be fitted out with skis to go through the Russian winter, and they carried wheels so that they could change over to wheels when they got out of the Russian snow. In the meantime, Napoleon, who had been defeated, returned to power, and there were soldiers and fighting all over the place. She wrote in her memoir about that trip, and it's inspiring. It took 3 months to go from St. Petersburg to Paris. The night she arrived in Paris, John Quincy was at the theater. This is her in 1817 when they returned. Just before they returned, this was done in England. They go back, he'd be Secretary of State. Oops, excuse me. Very touchy. This is John Quincy. You see a little change in him. I think the first portrait may have been a little favorable. Anyway, this is at the same time. This is just before they leave England to come back in 1817. But what about the other children? The other John and Abigail? I've alluded to them a little bit. Oops, come on down. This is Abigail Jr., Nabby, the daughter, the eldest. She had a tragic life. Before her mother took her to Europe in 1784, she was engaged to a man named Royal Tyler. If you know American Lit, he was a poet, dramatist, pretty famous guy at the time. But he was also a scoundrel. Anyway, she broke it off. I think maybe one of the reasons that John wanted her to come to Europe was to end the relationship. Unfortunately, when she got to England, she took up with John's private secretary, a man named William Stevens Smith, who was also a cad. He eventually left her high and dry, so she had to go back and live with the family. Also, adding to the tragedy of her life, she suffered from breast cancer and had a double mastectomy at home. She died relatively young. She was in her 40s. But she, like so many of the other people, had to come back to the home and live with the parents. Charles Adams was probably presented the most problem to John and Abigail. When he was at Harvard, they were still in Europe at the time, he got into all kinds of trouble. They kept very close records at the time. How many times did you miss class? How many times did you miss religious ceremonies? How many times were you involved in minor riots? He headed the list. As a matter of fact, there's one report of him streaking. Do you remember streaking? Streaking across campus. John did everything he could to try and promote him. He became a lawyer. He studied law, went to New York. As a matter of fact, he even studied law with Alexander Hamilton at one time. He married the sister of her husband, a Smith. Sally Smith was a fairly nice person. They had 2 children. Remember at the beginning of this presentation, The story is he died at the age of 30 of alcoholism. Tragic. But I told you that presentism comes to bear in history, where we look at current events and people who are interested in current events will try and read them back into the past. Some historians say now that the problem, because as a matter of fact, John Adams destroyed almost all the letters that he sent to the family, just wrote him off. So some historians, a couple of historians, modern historians, have read between the lines and they say he was gay, Charles, and that John was homophobic, and that he hated his son because he was gay. There is no evidence that he was gay, but if you pick and choose the documents and some of the things that were said at the time, I don't know. We don't know. The third son, Thomas Boylston, was moderately successful, but he was moderately successful. Oh, by the way, when Charles died, his wife and 2 children went to live at Peacefield with John and Abigail. Even before this, when Louisa Catherine first came from Europe to meet Abigail and John and came to the house, she said it was like going on Noah's Ark. The people were so strange, and anyway. Thomas Boylston was moderately successful. But the reason he was because his father had been president, his brother, John Quincy, was prominent, and so he was appointed a judge and tried to farm. In the end, he also died of alcoholism. When you look at the Adamses and the problems they had, alcoholism, early deaths. One of John Quincy Adams' sons committed suicide. So many of the problems that we as modern Americans suffer from in our families, they had the same problems. Anyway, I'd like to entertain your questions if you have any. Sir?
What problems do you see in another couple generations, 3 generations or so, 100 years from now, when historians, and what will be in the archives that will be most important to trying to get a good analysis of anything, a period or a people?
I think one of the things is, I think that we probably know more about John and Abigail and their family than we know about almost any modern presidential family, because they saved everything. Now people are very careful, or try to be. And a lot of the things that we hear are rumors, and it's like Kate Middleton. Do we really know anything about Kate Middleton? Other than what the tabloids and stuff say? That's the thing about the Adams papers. There are thousands and thousands of documents, and these were personal letters. They weren't sanitized. They didn't have literary agents. They didn't have secretaries going through these things. Oh, you can't say that. They said what they meant. That 15,000, John Adams had a diary, a long diary. Charles Francis Adams, John Quincy's son, kept a diary. And now a lot of times you think, well, maybe they thought somebody was going to look at this later, but I think that they're much franker, much truer than the kind of things, the information we get now. I think it's going to be harder going forward to understand modern society, politicians, and culture, because everything is sanitized and it's manipulated. Sir?
How much influence on the unsuccessful children may have come from the level of expectation related to grandfather, father, mother, grandmother.
I think there's a historian who's gone to his reward in the meantime. His name is Paul Nagel, and he wrote about the Adams family. He wrote on the Adams women. He wrote on the whole family, and he was very critical of Abigail. He thought that she was too demanding. As a matter of fact, there's one letter, and I can't remember. It's one of the times that when John Quincy is first going to Europe with his father, she writes him a letter. They get the letter along the way because they had stopped in Boston. And one of the things she said in it, I'm paraphrasing, I would rather have you sink, not if you're not going to be honorable, I'd rather have you drown at sea. So there was this expectation that she put on him. And Paul Nagel says that the reason, for example, those two boys, George Washington and John Adams II, that stayed in Massachusetts, they were under her tutelage for many of those years. Both of them crashed and burned. Charles Francis, that goes along with the parents to Europe, becomes successful. They were brothers. What was the difference? Paul Nagel would say it was Abigail, that she put too much pressure on people. But once again, it's a situation where we can look at the documents and we can pick and choose and create almost any story we want. So history isn't what happened, it's what the historians say happened. Anything else?
You said that the family was prominent through the 1800s. How so? I mean, I don't want to hear every little story.
Okay. John Quincy is the second generation. When he left the presidency, he was defeated by Andrew Jackson in 1828. He went into Congress. So can you imagine a president, after leaving office, he was in Congress for 18 years, I think. And very important. Do you know what the gag rule is? Have you ever heard of the gag rule? Southern congressmen were able to get a law passed that any petition, any action about slavery would be tabled immediately. It was a gag rule that you couldn't even talk about slavery. He was the most important person in overthrowing the gag rule. Have any of you ever seen the movie Amistad? Yeah. Okay, who was the great attorney that went to the Supreme Court? It was John Quincy Adams. So this takes us up right into the 1840s. I mean, as a matter of fact, he had a stroke in Congress, was carried out of Congress and died. So he was in Congress right up until almost the day he died. What's also amazing, if you think about the span of time, he, as a boy, witnessed the Battle of Bunker Hill. When he collapsed in Congress, one of the congressmen that carried him out was Abraham Lincoln. So you think of the span of time. His son, Charles Francis, is an important diplomat. He was important in working with England to try and keep England neutral during the Civil War. His son, Henry Adams, was a famous historian and writer. His brother, Charles Francis Adams II, was the president of the Massachusetts Historical Society. But anyway, Brooks Adams was a famous writer and historian, another one of the children. But they're from the 1770s until 1900. They are prominent politically, diplomatically, culturally. It's an amazing family.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so you said till 1900 they're prominent. Do we know of any relatives that would be still?
Oh yes, they're still around. Ben Adams is an investment banker in New York. There's other prominent figures. One, you know the company Raytheon, which is a big manufacturer of war materials. I can't remember the guy's name, but one of the brothers in the mid-20th century was the chairman of the board of Raytheon. So, I mean, they continued to, weren't as prominent as John Quincy and his father, but still were players.
Back to the idea about the expectations and the children that fail. Nature versus nurture.
Yeah.
What's the probability that those two just didn't have what it took?
Well, now you see, if you were writing the history, you would pick the documents that supported your case. I think that, I don't know that Abigail destroyed them, but I think some of her expectations hurt. So it's probably a mixture of each. Both John Quincy, who went with his father, got a much better education in Europe, had more experiences, met more people. Charles Francis, his son, when they went to Europe, he was not only, well, he was born in the United States, but he spent time in Russia, he spent time in England, where the other boys didn't. So they had more and better experiences. So, don't know. If they would have all stayed in Massachusetts, I don't know. Sir?
Do you have any insightful comments about the repaired friendship of John Adams and Thomas Jefferson in their later years?
Yes. The election, first of all, when John Adams was president, when he was elected president, Thomas Jefferson finished second and was the vice president. They didn't get along. They had different outlooks. And that would be sort of the beginning of the first political parties, the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. They had a falling out, especially after the election of 1800, because the election of 1800 was probably as bitter as the election that's coming up in 2024. Terrible things were written about both of them. Some were true. Just as a little anecdote, when Jefferson was the minister to France, he had two daughters. One of the daughters was with him. The younger daughter was still in Virginia. He decided to have the younger daughter come to France for her education. Put them in convents because they supposed that was a good education. So the girl came over, and on her way, she stopped in London and stayed with the Adamses. And Abigail wrote a letter to Thomas Jefferson saying, you should have had a more mature woman come with her, because the girl that's with her is so immature, I don't understand how you could do it. Guess who the young woman was? Sally Hemings. In case you don't know who Sally Hemings is. Okay. Enough said. Later, one of the ways that they get back together again, and there is a long correspondence in their later life, is that one of their common friends sent a letter to John saying, I had a dream that you two got back together. Is there any chance? And then somehow they started communicating again. Also, you know that they both died on the same day. 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. Well, of the document. Anyway, to me that's, what would you call it? Beyond amazing? Anyway, thank you.